All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on something, well, pretty fundamental to all of us, really. We're talking about how we think about knowledge, about
Yeah.
learning. Like what is it and how do we do it?
Yeah, exactly. And you know what? Educational psychologists have been looking at this for decades now. They call them epistemological beliefs.
Uh,
It turns out that how you think about knowledge, like what it is and where it comes from, that really has a massive effect on how you actually go about learning.
which for you, our listener, always wanting to get to the bottom of things, but also do it efficiently, right? Well, this is gold.
Hmm.
Like really understanding these beliefs, it's not just some academic thing. It's a legit shortcut to learning better, to thinking more critically even. It's like knowing the operating system your brain's running on when it's absorbing new info.
Exactly. And there's a ton of research on this. The sources we've been digging into for this deep dive, they go into all the different ways psychologists have tried to, make sense of these beliefs, even measure them. Some of them are theories that have kind of built up over time, each one giving us like a slightly different take on how we approach knowledge.
So, okay, our mission today is to pull out like the most useful stuff from these different models, different ideas about epistemological beliefs,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And then see how they actually affect how we learn. Let's jump in. It seems like the earliest research, they kind of tried to map out like a single path that everybody follows and how their thinking develops about knowledge, right?
Yeah, you're talking about the unidimensional theories. Like a good place to start there is William Perry's work back in 1968. He was looking at students at Harvard. He noticed this shift in their thinking over time. They started out with this very black and white view of things. Like there's a right answer, a wrong answer, and the authority figures, the teachers, they have the right answers.
So like a student who just wants the teacher to like lay it all out for them, tell them exactly what to put in their essays, no room for, their own thoughts or anything like that.
Exactly. And Perry, he came up with this 9-position developmental sequence. Over time, he saw these students moving away from this right-wrong thinking toward like a more relativistic view.
Mhm.
They started to see that context matters, that different people have different points of view, that knowledge wasn't always so absolute. So the key insight for our listeners here is to recognize if they tend to just look for, that one right answer and how that might be limiting their learning.
And he even tried to actually measure this change, this shift in thinking. He created something called the Checklist of Educational Views, CLEV for short.
That's right. It was a questionnaire trying to see if a student leaned more towards that black and white thinking, relying on authority, or if they had a more individualistic, relativistic view of things. Some of the questions, they were about, what students thought made a good teacher or how homework should be handled, like, agreeing with a statement like instructors should just present the facts and students can take their own notes. That might show that the student thinks knowledge is like out there to just be copied down.
Interesting. So a student who disagreed with that statement, they might be more open to a teacher who, encourages discussion, debate, and critical thinking in the classroom.
Exactly. Now, building on Perry's work, we have Kitchener and King. They came up with the reflective judgment model in 1981. Still a unidimensional theory, but this one focused more on the assumptions people make about, about what can even be known, about how we come to know it, and how certain we can be about things, especially when it comes to those really complex, messy problems, the ones that don't have, easy answers.
Right, like those problems you could argue about forever.
Yeah.
Like the best way to grow the economy or the ethics of genetic engineering, things like that. Like those big complicated questions where there's so many different sides to things and no one right answer, those are the kind of problems Kitchener and King were looking at.
Exactly. And they outline 7 stages of reflective judgment. It starts with the idea that knowledge comes from just, directly observing something. You see it, it's real, it's true. Then it moves through these stages where people start to understand that that knowledge is something we construct, based on weighing evidence, looking at things from different angles. In the later stages, people realize that some knowledge claims are just, better or more complete than others, even if you can't ever be like 100% certain about anything.
And how did they measure this? It sounds a lot more complex than just a checklist. It's a fascinating idea.
Uh,
But it sounds so hard to really like pin down and measure. How did they even begin to do that? This shift in perspective, I mean.
They used the reflective judgment interview. It involved giving people these complex dilemmas to think about, like that one about whether news reporting can ever be truly objective. Then they'd ask all these probing questions to really get at the reasoning behind their judgments. Very, very in-depth.
Sounds pretty time-consuming, though.
Mm.
Asking someone about a complicated issue and then really digging into, their underlying assumptions.
It is. An interview would typically take like almost an hour than scoring it. That required trained people to analyze the transcripts. They did start developing a paper and pencil version called the Reasoning About Current Issues test. It was meant to make it more practical for research with, more people.
Makes sense. You need something more efficient if you want to study those broader trends. Now, there was another unidimensional theory we mentioned, the epistemic doubt framework by Boyes and Chandler. This one was focused on adolescence, right? How teenagers think about knowledge.
Yeah, in 1992, they were looking at how teenagers approach the idea of certainty and knowledge. They came up with 4 levels. First, naive realism, where knowledge is just like perceiving reality directly. Then there's defended realism, where they start to acknowledge that there might be some bias, but they still believe in, objective truth. Then comes a dogmatism skepticism phase. Here they might cling really tightly to authority to give them like definite answers, or they swing the other way and become super skeptical of any claim to knowledge. Finally, they reach post-skeptical rational, where they understand that, we can make reasoned judgments even without being totally certain.
And they connected this to identity development, those stages everyone goes through of figuring out who they are and what they believe in.
Exactly. They were saying that someone who's still in that naive stage of believing in absolute truth, they might just accept beliefs without much critical thinking, what's called foreclosure in identity development, or they might just haven't really explored their own beliefs much at all, which is diffusion. But someone who's gotten to that post-skeptical rational stage, they've probably gone through a period of questioning, and they've made more deliberate choices about what they believe.
And to assess this, they used interviews with little stories, vignettes about controversial topics, like whether driver's ed should be mandatory or the long-term effects of colonialism. Yeah.
Exactly. They would ask the participants to talk about different sides of the issue and how they'd come to a conclusion. The way they explained their reasoning, that was the key to figuring out their level of epistemic doubt. So these early theories, they were all about trying to map out this like journey we all take towards more sophisticated thinking about knowledge. But then the focus started to like broaden a bit. People started looking at things like gender and the specific context of learning too. So, these early models, they provided a good framework, but researchers started to realize that people's beliefs about knowledge don't always develop in such a neat, step-by-step way.
Okay, so they started to question this idea that everyone follows the same path.
Exactly. Baxter Magolda, with her measure of epistemological reflection, MER for short, she really emphasized that knowledge is socially constructed, and that our ways of knowing, as she called them, are fluid. Instead of fixed stages, she looked at levels: absolute knowing, transitional knowing, independent knowing, and contextual knowing. And they all fit along this dimension of how certain we are about things. But what's really important is that she also looked at how these beliefs play out in the classroom, looking at the roles of the learner, their classmates, the instructor, even how they were evaluated.
So like a student who believes that knowledge is absolute, they might see the teacher as the only source of truth.
Yeah.
As someone who has a more contextual view, they might value, discussions with their peers, and they might see the instructor more as a guide or facilitator.
Exactly. Her method used standardized open-ended questions that allowed for like a deeper dive into these connections. And then around the same time, we have Belinkie and her colleagues. They published Women's Ways of Knowing, and that was huge.
Yeah.
It really challenged those earlier models that were, well, mostly based on men's experiences, right?
Right, that's a key point. And through all these in-depth interviews, mostly with women, they found 5 epistemological categories. First, silence, where women felt, like they couldn't speak up, that they had to rely on authority. Then there's received knowledge, where you learn by just listening to and accepting what the authorities tell you. Then there's subjective knowledge, where your own personal experiences and intuition becomes important sources of knowing. Then there's procedural knowledge, which actually had 2 distinct styles. Separate knowing, which is more analytical, like taking apart arguments, really examining them. And connected knowing, which emphasizes empathy, understanding other people's perspectives. And finally, constructed knowledge, where you're bringing together that subjective and objective knowing, being okay with ambiguity, really understanding the context of things. That difference between separate and connected knowing is really interesting. One focused on like dissecting and questioning, the other on relating to and understanding. Like, imagine a group project, right? Someone with a separate knowing style, they might be focused on finding the flaws in an argument, while someone with connected knowing might be more interested in why someone even holds that argument in the first place.
Exactly. Now, Belenky focused mainly on women, but Galati and her colleagues created the Attitudes Toward Thinking and Learning Survey, or ATTLS. This was designed to measure these dimensions of connected and separate knowing more efficiently, and to see if they applied to, everyone, men and women, even if maybe there were some gender-related trends.
Okay, so now we're moving away from this idea of one path for everyone.
Yeah.
We're starting to see theories that recognize different learning styles, how important social and contextual factors are. And then came the multidimensional theories. This sounds like things got even more nuanced.
They did. Marlene Schaumer, who goes by Schaumer Akins now, she was really leading this shift in thinking back in 1990. She said personal epistemology wasn't this single unified thing, but more like a system of, beliefs that were kind of independent and they could develop at their own pace.
So instead of thinking, if you become more open to different perspectives, you'll automatically start to see knowledge as less certain. Now it's like these different parts of how you think about knowledge can develop separately. Like you might believe that learning takes time, but you still think some people are just, naturally smarter. Those two things aren't necessarily linked.
Exactly. She originally thought there were 5 main beliefs. Structure of knowledge, like is it a bunch of random facts or more like a web of interconnected concepts? Then there's stability of knowledge. Is it fixed or, always changing? Source of knowledge. Does it come from, experts or your own reasoning and experiences? Then there's speed of learning. Is it usually fast and easy or does it take time and effort? And finally, ability to learn. Is intelligence fixed or something you can improve through hard work? So, for example, someone who thinks knowledge is always changing might be more comfortable with scientific theories being updated as we learn more,
And she created a questionnaire to try and measure these different dimensions separately.
Yes. Using Likert scales, people could say how much they agreed or disagreed with statements about these beliefs. And her initial research found 4 main factors: structure, stability, speed, and ability. Interestingly, the source of knowledge, that one didn't always show up as a separate, reliable factor. And that got her and other researchers thinking more about how these different beliefs might be interacting in, more complex ways.
And then other researchers built on her work, like Zhang and Schra.
Yeah. Zhang and his colleagues, they added another dimension, like orderly process of learning. This was getting at the idea that some students, because of how traditional schools are, they might come to believe that learning is always this linear step-by-step process. And then Schra's epistemic belief inventory, that also aimed to measure Schaumer's 5 beliefs, but trying to really make clear distinctions between, things like fixed ability, certain knowledge, omniscient authority, simple knowledge, and quick learning.
Okay, so now we've got a whole bunch of different ways to look at these independent beliefs about knowledge and learning. And then there's Deanna Kuhn's, her more recent multidimensional theory. This is where that idea of different judgment domains comes in.
Right. Kuhn and her team, they came up with 4 levels of understanding: realism, absolutist, multiplist, and evaluativist. But they also looked at how these levels might show up differently across 5 different areas of judgment: personal taste, aesthetics, values, social facts, and physical facts.
So it's like someone might be very evaluativist when it comes to physical facts. They understand that scientific knowledge is based on evidence and can be revised, right? But they might still have a more absolutist view when it comes to values, like believing in a clear right and wrong that never changes.
That's the idea. And they also thought there might be a specific order in which people tend to develop across these domains. Like they thought a multiplist view, that's the idea that everyone's opinion is equally valid, right? They thought that might show up first in things like personal taste, then move to like aesthetics, then values, social facts, and finally, our understanding of the physical world. And the shift towards an evaluativist perspective, where you're judging how good those opinions are based on, evidence and reasoning, that might happen in a slightly different order. Like think about something simple: favorite colors. Everybody's got one, and no one's is really wrong, right? Kuhn's theory is saying that we might start off applying that kind of thinking, everyone's opinion is equal, to more complicated stuff too.
That's really fascinating. And they even made a short forced choice questionnaire to try and measure these levels across, people of different ages. And they even compared how experts in different fields answer the questions compared to compared to people who weren't experts.
Exactly, and what they found kind of supported that developmental order they had hypothesized. The experts generally showed higher levels of evaluativist thinking in most of those judgment domains. So you see, this whole field has really come a long way from those first ideas of a single path everyone takes. Now we've got these much more sophisticated ways of thinking about how we think about knowledge. We're acknowledging that it's complex, that there are all these different dimensions involved.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So what are the main takeaways for you, our listener, who wants to, absorb all this as efficiently as possible?
Well, first, you got to realize that these different theories and the ways they're studied, they're focusing on slightly different aspects of these beliefs, whether it's about how certain knowledge is, its source, how we justify it, its structure, how fast we can learn, or even our own feeling about our ability to learn. There's no one definition that everyone agrees on, you
Yeah.
know. And second, that shift from unidimensional to multidimensional theories, that's a big deal. The old way of thinking was that all these beliefs, they kind of develop together. But now we think they can develop more independently. You might be awesome at evaluating evidence in one area, but still have some, more simplistic beliefs in another.
And the way these beliefs are studied, that's changed a lot too. It's gone from those super in-depth, time-consuming interviews to questionnaires that are, easier to score.
Exactly. And while those interviews give you, a lot of rich detail, questionnaires are better for doing research with more people and comparing different groups. But what's really important to remember is that the specific tool you're using, that's tied to the theory behind it. A questionnaire that's based on Schomburg's multidimensional theory, that's going to give you different insights than an interview designed to, assess Kitchener and King's stages, for example.
So thinking about your own learning, does this idea of,
Well, if you want to really learn effectively, you've got to understand your own tendencies when it comes to these epistemological beliefs. Like, if you tend to think that knowledge is fixed and there's only one right answer, you might be less open to new information that challenges what you already believe, or you might be more likely to just give up when you're learning something hard because you think, your ability is limited. Recognizing these tendencies, that's the first step to figuring out where you might want to, cultivate a more nuanced, more growth-oriented way of learning and evaluating information. Like if you realize you rely a lot on what experts say, you can make a conscious effort to find different sources, and try to critically evaluate stuff on your own. So for you, the listener, it's all about becoming more aware of your own assumptions about knowledge and learning.
so it's about being more self-aware, understanding that your basic beliefs about knowledge, those can actually help or hinder your learning. They can make it harder or easier to reach your goals. Okay, so to wrap it all up, we've seen how our understanding of beliefs about knowledge and learning has changed. We've gone from seeing it as one path everyone follows to a more complex view where there are all these different, maybe even independent beliefs that are, all mixed together.
And that key difference, whether you see it as one big process or a bunch of separate ideas, it really affects how we think about learning, about intellectual growth, even how we design educational experiences, for ourselves and others.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Which of these views on knowledge and learning, that idea of developmental stages or the idea of independent beliefs, which one of those feels more true to your own experience? And how could understanding these different models, how could that change how you approach new information, new challenges in the future? It's about understanding how you understand. And that, as always, is a deep dive worth taking.